welcome to this conversation. We're exploring making a positive difference in the media space and within the industry. And I guess if you look at the premise of MEFA and why it's been set up in the first place, it is to affect change for people of colour in the industry. And I guess it would be remiss of me not to mention that the industry historically hasn't always been a welcoming place, right? So I've been speaking in meetings around, communities of colour, and essentially historically, they would have gone into, I don't know, your public sectors, things like the NHS and probation and the police, etc., because they were seen as jobs for life. But what we are seeing is a massive turn and a massive difference. But when we show up into these industries, they don't always react to us in the right way. So for us, this is about not just us as people of colour or allies. This is about action and how we can create positive change long term. So if you do have questions, there is going to be a questions and answers at the end. This isn't a one-way conversation. This isn't just between us. We're hoping that we can all come to some sort of, I don't know, collective end where we go out there and we feel empowered enough to make a difference. Probably should have introduced myself first. So my name's Richie Booker. I am Head of Diversity and Belonging here at Hearst UK. I'm also a host for a show on 1Extra called 1Extra Talks, and that looks at everything through a black lens. My name's Richie Brave outside of work, just because the racists used to be able to find me by my name, but we'll get into that a bit later. It's not about me though. These are about my esteemed guests on the panel. So do you want to introduce yourself, let everybody know what your name is and what you do?
Richie Booker's a wicked name, by the way.
Name, right?
My name's Elaine Cruz. Nice to meet you, everyone. I am the co-founder of a DEI consultancy called Project 23 and a coaching organisation called Coaches of Colour, and a non-profit called the Equitable Coaching Foundation. We basically want to help workplaces be more inclusive and equitable. Funnily enough, though, and I don't always say this at different talks or when I meet people, but this is my second career. Before this, up until about 5 years ago, I worked in media as well. So I was in commercial all the time. I had trading director roles. I had head of advertising roles. So I feel like I worked at Dennis Publishing for a long time. So coming here, I feel like, it's a bit of a homecoming to just be amongst our people again. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Cool. So I'm Ryan de Cruz. I'm a group strategy director here at Hearst, and sort of just my career background. So I've been in the industry for about 20 years. I've worked at Mediacom, where Michelle and I sort of started our careers together. I've worked at Yahoo, Telegraph, Social Chain, and I've come to Hearst. So I've kind of seen the industry from lots of perspectives, and hopefully could have a good chat with you guys today as well.
I'm Michelle Sarpong. I currently work at the 7 Stars, and my role is currently, wait for it, Head of Display, Audio and Out-of-Home Activation. I also have a trading role as well within the organisation, and as Ryan said, I worked at Mediacom. I've been in the industry for like 15 years, so I've worked across Mediacom, Mindshare, OMD, Dentsuite, just in now the 7 Stars, so I have been around. You can ask me later as to why I left at some of those places, but that's a whole nother chat. But yes, and I'm very happy to be here on my first MEFA panel.
Hi, Simon Haynes. I'm Head of Digital at Havas Lynx, which is the healthcare and pharma end of Havas, although I think they want to change my job title. But I've been around for 25 years, so I guess I'm the oldest person on this panel. Worked on, before joining agency, I worked in lots of publishers, running teams there, and lots of MarTech running teams there as well. Lovely to see you all, especially those that I've worked with, so shh.
Give us the stories later, yeah? Don't listen to that. So yeah, I guess to frame, and I did a bit of this a bit earlier on, but for us, Positively Hearst is one of our taglines, and this is why this is influencing the conversation that we're having today. We always try and frame things, and I'm not talking about positive washing, but what I am saying is telling stories in a positive way. So this leans into empowerment as well, right? So even when the story is difficult, being positive behind it is more about giving the person the correct voice or the correct platform to voice their experience. And that's what we try and do here at Hearst. And this is what we're attempting to do alongside MEFA with this conversation today. When we planned this out, we got very macro, we were kind of talking about businesses and industry, and this is how you change everything. And we're going to talk a little bit about this today, but I guess the main focus is what we can do as individuals to create tangible change. So when you're listening to this conversation, when you're thinking about your questions, think about what you can do as an individual in your space to start to create or shape the environment in which you're in inside the industry? Which brings me to my first question. It's a heavy one, you know. You feeling ready?
Always. Look at us.
So, Simon, it is you though, and I think I'll come to you afterwards, Michelle. As you both work in the agency side of things, have you ever been like faced with a brief where diversity and belonging just hasn't been considered? Like it just hits you in your email and you read it and you're like, are you lot all right?
So, truthfully, within pharma and healthcare, not really, because 30% of all clinicians in the NHS are non-white, right? Which is quite cool. So if you're a pharma company and you don't appeal to the diversity that exists within the NHS, you're some kind of idiot. So not really. However, there has been circumstances where I have been faced with a strategic decision that is not diverse, right? So I work for a MarTech firm, and our engineering hub is based in Atlanta. They call Atlanta Chocolate City for a reason, right? And I walked into the office of 160 engineers. There was not a single black person in the office, not a single one. And I was like, wow, what's happening? And the usual response was, hey, we can't find it for our recruitment. We go to Georgia Tech, we can't find the candidates. I was like, you're in Atlanta, this is not a good look. And also, I don't think you're getting the best talent through. And the reason why I mention that is because I was really frustrated, really, really angry. But the one thing that I learned from that experience is that you've got to confront these situations with a three-sided conversation. You know, they say there's three sides to every conversation. It's incumbent on you, if you want to make change, to approach it in the same way. You've got your own perspective. So for instance, from a creative side, you could spot that actually this is not a diverse brief in any way, shape or form. This does not represent the audience that you're going for. That's a very personal, individual feeling. The best way to adopt that feeling for me is to also empathize with the person that's put together that brief, or our head of engineering product in Atlanta, and try and empathize with their point of view. And then the clever part, the really clever part, and I'll be honest, I'm still a work in progress on learning this bit, is to approach it from the third point of view, which is to zoom out, look at it from a cold-hearted, objective point of view, and try and approach it with that narrative that marries the two in order to get your point across. Because unfortunately, individualistic notions usually lead to conflict, in my experience, right? If you get two individuals that have individual point of views, what you're going to get is conflict. And I think you get a lot more further with regards to your conversation, especially when you're trying to evolve a piece of thinking, or you're trying to be a good stakeholder, or just point out the fuckery that's in front of you. If you don't adopt conflict, but actually adopt empathy and bring people along that journey with you. So it doesn't answer the question about creative, but it's another way of saying, look, this happens in all kind of facets of what we do on a day in, day out basis. And that's personally how I would address it.
Thank you. And you also broke the swearing threshold.
I'm sorry.
So I'm really glad you did that.
I'm sorry.
I saw people in the room kind of relax as you did it.
2 minutes in, joke.
But it makes a lot of sense, because I think what you're speaking about, I mean, if we're going to be real from a commercial perspective, we're all in the business of making money, right? So that relationship side is so important. And what I've got from what you're saying is, actually, if you look at it from a collective perspective, if it isn't just individual against individual, and you look at this relationship and how you can create something and do something together, it strengthens the relationship and allows you to meet your goal.
That's what the sharp people, you look at most of the industry leaders, right? What they're unified in is that you don't really know much about them because they're really bland, because they're really adept at approaching any individual situation from a perspective of, you know, objectivity. It's a really hard skill set to attain, right? And I'm old and I've not yet to attain it because I get emotional about things, but I tend to think it's because I care. But the real sharp operators can approach it from that objectivity, and if you learn it, you can really make a difference, I feel.
This really speaks to the diversity space. I'm triggered. Michelle, can you give me an example of maybe when a brief has landed for you and your mind's been blown? about the lack of diversity embedded in it?
Yeah, so I named all my agencies, so you can't pinpoint what client I'm talking about. But I used to work on a film client, and we got a brief on a film that had 3 black leads in there, and I was just like, oh great, this is amazing. Like, you know, they gave us kind of suggestions as to where we should place it, and I was just like, actually, you know, it's female black leads. I was just like, I've got some ideas, like, you know, there's the Pride, the Voice, there's publications that we can actually kind of, you know, invest in. So I kind of fed that back. I was an account director at the time, so I had my manager on the team. I fed that back to her because she wasn't aware of these publications. But I was like, let's add them on the plan, see how it goes down. She came back to me after the client gave feedback and went, so the client's asked to remove those titles off. And I was just like, why? Do we not have enough budget? What's gone on? And she was like, because they don't want to market it as a black film. And
What does that mean?
Well, exactly. But I was just like, okay. I mean, I must admit at the time, and she was really awkward about telling me because she's white. She's one of my really good friends. She was white, and she was just like, don't know. But I'm glad she mentioned it to me because I was a little bit hurt, but I was a bit like, fine, I hear what you're saying. But let's fast forward like 10 years later, and we've seen like Black Panther was marketed as a black film unapologetically, and it's like what? Grossed 14th highest grossing film of all time. So, you know, more for them for not doing that. And I think the money speaks for itself. I think what I learned from that situation till now is the fact that actually we're more open to having those conversations. And I'm seeing that more of the briefs that we're kind of getting from clients. So for example, we've got TSB as a client, and Pride of Britain Awards, if anyone knows, that's like, you know, celebrating like local heroes in like areas of Britain. So we had one winner, Michelle, great name, and she was from Hackney, and she did a lot of community work about, you know, like getting, you know, groceries, food from different providers and actually cooking for a whole community. She's from Hackney, so we were like, when we got that brief, we were like, okay, she's from Hackney, let's suggest the fact that to celebrate her winning, let's do a mural. We know what murals and graffitis in that area does for the community, and we were like, that aligns with her community, that message. And actually the client was amazing. They did it. It was announced in that way. It was used on ITV when she was like, you know, announced as a winner. And that campaign actually did more than what we could anticipated from a standpoint in terms of PR, anything that came from it, and actually spoke authentically to her and the community. So I think, like, you know, I've been in the industry for a long time, and I saw from, you know, when I worked on a film client, I was told no, to now with, like, you know, TSB as a client who actually took that conversation and was like, actually, we're going to try and invest in that, because we know, like, you know, we've heard stuff like the Black Pound report, you know, that Lydia Omoda has done, like, that speaks volumes. Like, there's money in that community. And I think, fair enough, you know, that film client didn't come on that journey at that time. They're obviously kicking themselves now because they didn't make as much money as, you know, Black Panther. But, you know, we saw the change of TSB. So that the small change, I mean, that's quite a relatively small impact that we made, but we're seeing the changes happening with our clients and those briefs, and they're just more open to it.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to add a bit actually and have a perspective, because we work with a number, from a DEI consultancy perspective, we work with a number of creative agencies. So I was always media owner, so I was like, who are these mythical creatures that work at creative agencies, right? But I think that to the point about there is change, but progress can be slow, but it is there. And I think it is up to individuals to keep that going. So the kind of anecdotes that we often hear is in those creative meetings with clients. There's a power piece in there as well, obviously. The clients hold the power. And, you know, inappropriate things will get said. We've heard a lot of anecdotes about, you know, no, I don't want to cast any black people in this because it's not going to reach my market. Based on nothing, no stats, just bias, racism. And there is if you zooming out, if you really zoom in, there's challenges with all, you know, if you think about the decision-making unit before that ad gets placed in front of the audience, there's all these different component parts. And from what we see is there are conversations and there is tension at all of those elements where people are trying to make a difference, trying to challenge, in that instance, the client. But sometimes it's not safe to do so, or it's not able to. But these are the other conversations that are happening. There are still problems out there. There's probably inappropriate things being said consistently, but there are also kind of positive changes when people do kind of call it out or ask for a manager to kind of step in, bring it up to the CEO, how do we stand on this? Or just ask for mental health support, because, you know, sometimes being in a room when those things get said is not a safe place to be. I just want to add that in there.
I think to your point that if you look at client, creative, planning, buying, where the ad actually resides on the publishing side, I think the disconnect is You know, I see a lot of clients where there's not a huge amount of diversity. So as a result, empathy for their chosen audience. And as a result, the media plans, to your point, aren't really diverse, right? They're not embracing the fact that there is, you know, a wide array of diversity in this country, and more importantly, money, right? You know, there is a black middle class, there is an Asian middle class, there is a middle class of every single minority you could tick a box on in this country. And people aren't embracing it, right? And a lot of the time, it's kind of like the tokenism of the creative makes up for all of the rest of the spectrum and all the other stakeholders, which I don't think is accurate, right? You know, you put a face or a couple in an ad or a piece of creative, you think of ticking that box and everything's cool. Well, actually, no. Who's making decisions at the client end, and where does the ad reside? I think that's where we need to really concentrate on.
I've got a further question before I come to you, Ryan, based on your experience, Michelle. Can everyone at the back hear me? Us all, you can hear everyone. Amazing. So I guess my question, because I feel like we've jumped a step, right? So if we take it back a bit, and we're talking about being in businesses that are in the habit of making money, and when we're attempting to make these decisions, okay, fine, that's the outcome, that's where we want to get to. But can you talk to me about those tangible steps you took to introduce a new way? Because there's rigidity sometimes, right? When you're attempting to have these conversations with people who may not necessarily understand the reality because it doesn't fit within their own perspective and their own lived experience. Can you talk to me about some of the tangible steps you took to bring in those fresh ideas or change people's perspectives?
I think money talks, let's be honest. That is mainly what clients care about. I think there has been a shift from, I personally believe, like during the COVID and the George Floyd murder, that actually forced a lot of clients and brands to kind of focus on their kind of D&I, their values and that perspective. So I do think that journey has moved on a little bit. I think for us, what we try to do is kind of meet them where they're at. Because I think, as we've touched upon, like some clients are quite open to have these conversations, some are not. So if we talk from the point that there is, you know, a lot of money in certain communities, I think, you know, I've mentioned the Black Pound report, and actually from the ethnic minorities that we kind of ignore consistently, there is a lot of spending power there. So actually taking them through the facts, you can't really argue with that. I think that's always the initial thought that we always go with. Also, we kind of speak to our partners as well in terms of like pushing that diverse content as well. So if we are speaking to certain partners and actually we're like asking them, okay, so what are you guys doing around D&I? What kind of content are you producing? And actually putting that in front of the clients as well. If they know that actually this is an interest from publishers, an interest from agencies as well, they can't help but not take our advice, because that's what we're there for. We're there to provide them with advice around, you know, where best to place their media to hit that KPI and objectives. And actually more and more clients are adding, you know, D&I to their kind of KPIs in terms of hitting that audience on all different levels. So collectively, if we all go on that journey together, they will come on that journey as well.
And I guess for some, it feels like a dirty word, right? So as someone, my job, day-to-day job is diversity and belonging.
Yeah.
And getting people to understand, actually, if this is embedded in the right way, it leads to commercial success
100%.
And the viability of a business. Is there a tension there sometimes between people always not feeling comfortable that doing diversity in the right way makes money? Do you know what I mean? Some people see diversity as this moral thing, but actually we're talking about it from a business perspective, and sometimes it feels like there's a bit of a conflict between the two.
Yeah.
I think collectively we struggle with that narrative, right? Bottom line is, people only change their minds really out of guilt or because it affects them in the pocket. And I think collectively, as a commonwealth of people who are in it for the right reasons, we struggle to strike that narrative of, you make more money if you stop being so conservative in your thought process, right? You make more money.
But there's something in the way of that, though, because I just couldn't, because I couldn't tell you the amount of times where I have heard that you're not going to meet anyone who tells you in business, I don't care about DE&I. Yeah. Furthermore, or I'm so passionate about DE&I. I really believe, I love what you do. No one wants to be thought of as a racist or a sexist or any other ist, right? Mm-hmm. So everyone kind of talks about it's the right thing to do. And for me, I do what I do because I do think it is the right thing to do. But I also believe that there's value in what I do in my job because it helps the kind of bottom right-hand corner of that spreadsheet. However, there's a barrier like a compassionate barrier that I've got to acknowledge, that people don't want to say I'm in it for the business reasons. But it's weird and a bit wild because most of us are in, like when you're in a workplace, you're here not because it's the right thing to do, because the right thing to do for me is to be on the beach. Really,
Bring me with you, please.
Really, what brings us together is what are my company goals, what are we trying to do as an organisation, so how does DE&I line up with that? And I think the kind of right thing to do notion is the bonus on top, but we need to get over the fact that that shouldn't be what it's okay if it's not the thing you're passionate about. How does it make sense?
I just wanted to bring Ryan in here, then I'll come to you, Simon. Yeah, because Ryan, we're trying to hear from you, man. So,
I just couldn't help it.
like Ryan, this is something that you really champion at Hearst, and I really want to hear from you around what like individuals can do to bring their clients in. Because this is something you champion here and have a lot of experience with. And then Simon, I'll come to you.
Yeah, cool. I think it's a challenge to, firstly for people to have that courage to talk about it. But a lot of the conversation, which is something that never gets taught, money is a dirty word and profit is a dirty word. But, a lot of my job, so I'm a strategy director, and is looking at our audience at Hearst and where are there opportunities for clients, where are there really rich audiences, especially when you've got cost of living, clients are looking to, bolster their things. So actually, if you can if you can prove to a client in a strategic way, okay, actually you're missing out on this percent of the market, here's an opportunity to talk to them. Have you thought about talking to them in this way? There was one brief where it was for a technology product, it was like Zoom, but it wasn't Zoom. And it was talking about how do you get people together. So the traditional brief talks about Christmas or, there's gatherings. And at the time of so I'm married to a Hindu lady, and Diwali is really big. And Diwali is a time when it's not a public holiday. It's often in the middle of the week. You've often got family all over the place. So it was almost a case of, well, could you look at learning about Diwali, using Diwali in your response? It's something the client might not be aware of, but actually it's a really good opportunity. And it's often, I think, the one thing I would say across this in terms of how do you get people to make those differences is don't be afraid. You often know more than your clients. Your clients sit in a bubble, whether they sit in a marketing department, and they've always used the same media because it delivers the same results, and they're always scared about losing their budgets, is actually, you sometimes know more than them. And the thing we talk about, how do you make the change, is actually people are scared to almost have an opinion because for fear of offending people. So actually, if you're from a community, if you're from an Asian background, a different minority background, you can actually give that advice credibly because you're part of it. So if any of my sort of MEFA team here is actually don't be afraid to speak up and share those experiences, but then identify, well, I think there's a real big opportunity in Eid over there or in Ramadan, and have those conversations. Be prepared to take criticism or something coming back. But those little steps, that you can show that no matter how experienced you are, you can be in the business for 25 years, you can be in for 2 years. It doesn't matter. You have that cultural viewpoint, which is huge.
And with regards to your point about not being afraid to talk about money and business, right? It's really important because the guys that not necessarily against diversity, but don't prioritize it, they talk about money, right? Bud Light will tell you that because when they partnered with an influencer, the people that were against diversity and that decision made sure everyone knew how much money apparently Bud Light was losing. Now, they didn't lose any money, right? But they made sure that narrative was there front and center. So all I'm trying to say is that when you're an advocate of diversity and you be an advocate for it, not only because it suits you as an individual, but be an advocate because it makes money, right? And we shouldn't be afraid of extolling that narrative, arguing that narrative, and implicitly building the empathy for that narrative because people think it's the right decision to make, not because they're guilty, because guilt only gets you so far. Guilt only gets you so much budget, right? If they think that there's going to be a 10x return, there'll be more budget. And you can talk about Nike, you can talk about Adidas, you can talk about Red Bull, you can talk about all the brands that have embraced diversity and how much money they're making. There's so much evidence out there if you're willing to look for it, that it shouldn't be a conversation we're afraid of. I hope that makes sense. Sorry.
No, it does.
So I got evangelical there.
Yes! Michelle, is there a chance of getting that wrong? So given the conversation we've just had and it being the right thing to do and speaking in a language that everybody understands, Ryan, you spoke to being strategic, you speak about the pocket. if essentially, the moralistic side isn't working. But what I hear quite often is pink washing or like race washing or being performative. Like outside of just hitting the brief, how do you embed those considerations when it comes to like planning, buying, etc.? I mean, what do you consider to ensure that it lands properly for those communities?
I mean, I think for us, especially from an agency point of view, is always asking why you're doing it. So I think it's always asking the why. So I think people like, greenwashing, pinkwashing, like whatever, blackwashing, whatever you want to call it, that comes from the fact that people are just trying to tick a box. And actually, people can see straight through that. We know the feedback loop these days are a lot quicker with social media. You get something wrong, you hear about it very quickly. But
I'm usually in them comments, to be honest.
Soz.
Yeah.
But yeah, why not? You're doing good things. So I think in terms of that, from an agency point of view, it's always asking the right questions and actually making sure that actually when we're doing a campaign, it's aligning with client values. Because there's no point in doing something that's completely far from what you stand for. And I think one thing that 7 Stars were quite good at in terms of we've got 7 values. I mean, shock. But we've got 7 values that we work to. And obviously when we kind of pitch for clients, we make sure that aligns. And obviously DE&I is one of the big things that we kind of work with. So we always come with that lens with clients anyway, when we're looking at certain client briefs, etc. I do think tokenism is a big thing. I think we did get to a point where people were doing a lot of like, quick, we need to make sure that we appear in one way. But actually, really and truly, it is actually just asking the why consistently and making sure that actually everything that we're doing is quite considered. And actually, it could just be small. It can be really small. Like obviously gave the TSB example before, but it's a step in the right way.
I think it's also just leaning into that from, like, obviously we work at Hearst, and one of the good things, I have worked at other places before where it hasn't been safe, but you generally like walking the walk and talking the talk is something we talk a lot about when it comes to D&I. And actually, if you look at the covers that we have, our kind of content with LGBTQ plus, with body image, with different communities, we produce that content. I was in a meeting the other day, and there's a girl who's bisexual came up to me and goes, "Can you tell your editor on Cosmo thank you, because it's the first media publication that I've read that actually represents me." So what we know is that there's the kind of tokenism angle, but actually if you get the conversation right, you create really strong advocates who will talk to other people in those communities. And similarly, it may not be for everybody. I think this is the one thing, we talk about diversity. There are people who don't have that open-minded look, and it's almost, for a lot of clients, it's finding, doesn't mean you have to one size fits all. You find different groups of people think differently. So I think for us at Hearst, it's very much about not just talking about it, but actually it's not just an image and we put it on a cover and then that's it and we don't create any content. It's following it through, it's building that community, it's giving them the empowerment, because it's about positivity, which is what we do, is essentially getting them to talk to other people about it and starting that conversation. Yeah. And we've got a lot, we've got a lot of stuff on feedback loops where we do, in my team, we do research and focus groups and things and actually find out certain messages don't resonate. We've maybe approached something in one way and they go, actually, no, I don't want you to talk about this community in this way, but actually this I would love to know more about. So again, everyone is constantly learning. I think as long as you have the correct feedback loops, it can really help. It's harder for a client because they go broader, but obviously a media owner, through social media, through comments, through focus groups, we have a bit more of a tighter control on what we do.
There's something about representation in that mix as well, like this, because representation for me, it's important. Like if there's a Filipino on the TV, then believe that me and my family are saying, like, look on BBC One right now or whatever, right? That is still happening, right? But and I'm still on the lookout. If I go to an event or if I see an advert, I'm still on the lookout for the Southeast Asian representation. But it doesn't sell me Nike. It doesn't sell me stuff. I'm just happy. It's better than nothing. But then if I think about like Disney, I'm Catholic, trying to be. I love Christmas. The British market tends to love Christmas as well, so there's a Christmas ad. And for me, there's something about making sure that representation is just the beginning, because really what sells stuff is the stories, is the connection. So, Disney ran an ad and it was centered around family, and it was a Filipino family. And the moment one of the little girls talking to her grandmother in the scene said, Lola, that's it, all the Filipinos are done, because Lola means like grandmother. And then you can see the context. Then, we're all talking to each other. But that connects with me, and it sold me Disney at Christmas because, I'm suddenly warm and really fuzzy. So I think there's the challenge. Representation is getting better, but I encourage everyone to to challenge that to the next stage of, okay, so what are we going to do inside the mag? What's happening next? And how are we making sure that it's an authentic voice in there? Because, you know, it has to represent and hit well. And then funnily enough, the notion of family and cross-generational relationships will spread to other markets beyond.
It's really interesting because I've got two questions. I think one point I think is really poignant for everybody in the room, and I didn't want to lose it. Use the example of seeing a Filipino person on the TV and calling up your family, and people who weren't Filipino in the room started laughing because they can relate to it. So there's that relatability in a concept that may necessarily be very poignant in your own community, but other people who are outside of your community can relate to it.
I dropped it in there because
you did it nicely.
I thought you'd all, some of you might get that.
But doing it in the right way, Ryan, I wanted to ask you, because this is something that you do at Hearst, making sure you get that right, when you have to consider all of those different points, when you have to remove tokenism, when you need to make sure that you're going back in the right way, like how do you get those feedback loops strong? Because you've spoken about them. And how do you create an environment where people aren't fearful? Because we talk about this stuff like it's so easy, but I think sometimes when we don't get it right, there's this fear, right? Oh, if I do it like this group's going to think it's tokenism. But if I do it like that group's going to be angry, and maybe the client's not going to understand. How do you manage all of those relationships and kind of remove the fear so you can bring yourself to the next step?
I think people are scared because of social media, especially. People are really scared if I put something out there and I get it wrong, it's like game over. And like I do a lot of work on sustainability. Some brands don't want to ever touch it because they know they're getting hammered. If they're doing something good, they're going to get hammered for the thing they don't do as well. So I think it is kind of constantly listening and is maybe testing things. I think is a really important thing. You know, we have concepts that we've played with. We've got one, for example, called the Rainbow Crew, which is on Digital Spy, which is all about LGBTQ plus people behind the camera, and almost going to the community and getting them involved in it. I think the key thing is actually you talk about authenticity, and I think that is the real key with it. Is some of these organisations, some clients, even agencies as well, don't necessarily have the people from different backgrounds. Is don't be afraid to buddy up. No one's trying to. When you get this message right, you're not trying to beat anyone else. You're actually trying to be authentic. So if you can involve people from different communities in the actual inception or the creation of content, that works really well, and kind of, you know, get their feedback at that point. We've had projects, I know internally, where we think it's a good idea. Okay, this commercially is an opportunity, or this might relate to brands and the brands that we have, and then we go and talk to a community group in that space. We obviously use, you know, you, Richie, for that. And then they go, actually, no, don't talk to us about that because it means this. And it's not as obvious to us from a commercial or a strategic point of view, but from a cultural point of view, someone else knows. So pulling experts, I think, is really valuable.
I was just about to come to you, so I'm glad you're about to speak.
One thing I've noticed, the difference between consumer, after 23 years in consumer and going to pharma, is the amount of investment they do to be authentic, right? So we had a campaign come up for prostate cancer. Prostate cancer affects black males 7 times more than any other sector of society. So if you're over 40 and black, get your prostate examined, just to go to your GP tomorrow. But when the brief came through, they had done 5 years worth of clinical trials in order to release this drug, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews with black males. So what was ironic is that they had a persona that they created whose name was Stephen, not Simon, and he was 46, had 3 kids, and it was like, Jesus, they've really done their homework because you're talking about me. And you don't get that on consumer side. Now, admittedly, they don't have that runway of clinical trials, but they know when they're going to release a product, right? So why not do the same investment to be authentic? So when the brief came through, the authenticity to a black middle-aged male was clear and obvious, and I was looking. Right, obviously, because this affects me as an individual. But it was astonishing, the amount of research they did in order to be authentic. So the decisions they made, the creative decisions they made, the placement decisions they made were totally authentic all the way through. Now, admittedly, they're making tens of millions of this drug, right? But nevertheless, you've got to do the investment. You've got to do the business investment in order to be authentic. It's not about placement because of gut feel or whatever. Have you done the research? And if your brands haven't done the research, they're not going to be authentic.
And I think, sorry, just on that point, from from the tools that we get in the industry. So, like I use a lot of TGI, Kantar, Mintel. Some of the things that we have because of a minority group being a minority, you don't get that representation. You go into TGI and you're typing in adults 16-34, like that's as as broad as you can get. But you don't really get those cultural nuances coming through planning tools. And that's, I was talking to Kantar yesterday actually about, they were like, well, how can we do more? What could we do? And it's almost like a collective swell in our industry. If we're wanting this to be representative in our plans and what we put out in media, we need it in the planning tools. So we need to go to the research company. It sounds a bit dry and a bit dull, but actually you think about all the media strategies developed, you're using planning tools. Now, if they're not showing up in the planning tools, they're almost they're almost invisible. So it's people, I'm talking to Kantar about it, but it'll be people in the group, talking, can you talk to your research guys? Can you find out what you can find out to increase that swell from when you're doing a proportional representation on a research study to being a bigger thing, to really understand the nuances? Because there are so many nuances when it comes to culture as well.
Yeah, I think.
Michelle, did you want to add?
Yeah, there's loads of points I want to add too, but I'll end on your point. On that, actually, I think that's a massive gap. And I think one thing that I would implore everyone to do is say what you don't see. Because I think in the research space and in terms of TGI runs, that's how we kind of decide where media goes. So that's so important. So if we're not represented in those studies, we're not going to see any of that investment in those kind of publications or wherever it might be. So I guess from our point of view, 7 Stars, we our research team actually did notice that, and we kind of co-partnered with Voices for All. So we basically kind of worked with them to make sure that in those quantitative research platforms, more than just age, gender, race is one thing that's kind of pinpointed, sexuality, and all the other layers that people don't think about in terms of everyone always thinks social demographic, age and gender. That's the only things that we care about, and that's who you need to target. But there's so many layers that we've obviously all discussed today. So that's one thing that we did as the agency. We were we don't see this in our kind of research, so let's put our money where the mouth is and actually co-partner with this kind of organisation and make sure this is reflective
I'm thinking about, we've got the data, we've got the information, and Simon, I wanted to ask you, we've got all the information, the numbers that we need to inform what we're doing. But I've got a question around tonality, messaging, conversation. Are there any tools or services that people can use to support them, maybe when they're feeling a little bit unsure?
Yeah, and that's a good point. You've got to be brave to have these conversations, right? Especially if the only person in the room that shares your thought process, right? You've got to be pretty brave. So let's just call it out early doors. 9 out of 10 times these conversations might not happen because, you don't feel it's the right context to have it. However, it goes back to the empathy thing again for me, right? We have tons and tons of tools. And I realise before I say this puts a lot of emphasis on the individual, right? And a lot of responsibility and accountability on the individual, which is unfair, but it is what it is, right? You have to take all of that information that is at hand. You have to take all of that research, all of that effort, all of that investment, and you need to be able to communicate it and communicate it with that level of empathy, right? Because what we do on a day in, day out basis is communicate. Irrespective of whether you work for an agency or a client or a publisher or a martech, you are involved in the business of communication. And I think sometimes we just need to be better at that communication. And the foundation of it is empathy. Do I understand what's going to trigger this person across the table to invest in what I'm saying? And it is a lot of responsibility, it is a lot of accountability. You have to be you have to have a high level of bravery to do it. I'm not getting away from that. And maybe after 24 years, I'm a little bit more settled and, being and experiencing having that conversation. But trust me, if you can tap into what motivates the person on the other side of the table, be it money, as we've spoken about before, be it shared greed or whatever it could be, right? You can get further than being confrontational. And if you have the evidence to back it up, all you've got to do is put it in a way that communicates with empathy.
Sure. But there's 2 things there actually. I fully agree with you. I think one thing we need to sit in is our diversity is our superpower. And I touched on it earlier in terms of actually the industry is ready to listen to us now, right? So actually sit in that power and be brave, as someone was saying, in terms of having those conversations. But I know from personal experience it's not always easy, but this is where allies come in, right? Because allies are just as important. So in terms of trying to figure out how we can frame that conversation with a certain client, I think I'm imploring allies to be a bit open to kind of help us on that journey and everyone else on that journey when they need to have those conversations, because we know it's not easy. In terms of the framing that someone was talking about, I think collectively we need to do that together, because again, like someone touched on it, like you can come across potentially as confrontational when you're not trying to be, even by showing the facts. But I think this is where allyship comes into play massively.
I'm about to open it up to questions from all of you. But before I do, I wanted to bring you in, Elaine, because we're talking about bravery. We're talking about, you know, being brave enough to use the right language. But as a coach, as people of colour inside of the room, there are going to be a number of barriers that stand in our way. Sometimes it's us. People talk about imposter syndrome. I get a bit annoyed about that because I don't think we should be managing imposter syndrome. The environment is making us feel like imposters, not ourselves, right? So it's deconstructing that stuff that sits outside of us. But as a coach, you know, have you seen any common themes that maybe restrict us to get to the point where we're feeling brave or we feel like we're able to rise up our voices? And what advice might you give for people inside the room who maybe want to speak up or know what the answers are, but don't feel empowered enough to do so?
It's a great question, actually. And I am, just your point about imposter syndrome, I'm of that nature as well. And that's probably a good theme, actually. So, you know, I'm assuming everyone here has heard of imposter syndrome. Perhaps at some point you might have thought, oh yeah, I have that. And I think what's important for me, so to answer in terms of practical advice and support, is if you're particularly if you're from a marginalised group, for me, my belief, and I think maybe I'm in line with you here, Richie, is that it's not necessarily, imposter syndrome implies that it's a thing that we personally have to pathologise ourselves, right? That we have to work through. Actually, when I was in media, when I was in advertising, I would often be in rooms full of white men, often, or men, right? And I certainly wasn't in many rooms with other women of colour. That made me think I wasn't good enough, I didn't talk the right way, and I was fucking good, right? I was good, but I carried something thinking that it was me. I see other people, I see these people in other places getting to the top, I need to be better, right? No, what I have learned is that actually it's about the awareness of the system is not rigged for me. Okay, so media, advertising, a lot of workplaces operate for certain types of people. I was able to navigate my way through it to a degree, but I was never going to make it to the board in where I was because they didn't recognise my value and my skills and my experience. What has shifted for me, which I implore you to think about if you're someone who might think I've got imposter syndrome, is to really rise out of it a little bit and work out what are the systems that are in place, what's important around here, who tends to excel here, what makes them perceived as great, how do I perceive myself, how am I going to navigate through this? Understand what's important to the organisation, to the industry that you're in. And there are a number of ways that you can then kind of work out who you are if you haven't done that before. For me, I think I'm assuming lots of people are in here to drive their career forward as well as being inclusive or celebrate diversity. The one thing that I would like to offer people particularly from marginalised backgrounds is your career. If you didn't know this already, I'm hoping I'm talking to a room where you might know this already. Your career is not just the role or the job that you're currently in. Okay, it's not even the next career or role that you're going to be in. It is everything that is around it. So it's what is the system that's in place? How does it work at Hearst? Who's great here? What do I need to do? Who's going to help me? Who can I trust? Work on the other things that are peripheral, that the system that you operate in, as well as work on what makes you fucking great. What are your strengths? What's your values? And own that in terms of, you know, talk about personal brand all the time. What do I want people to know of me? And who's going to help me kind of get there? And all those kind of, that macro thing as well as my internal thing, I think that helps a lot. And that's not just for people from underrepresented groups. That's how to navigate a place generally. So I think if you have that in your toolkit, you can kind of try to work your way through other things, other barriers. But if you know what your strengths are and what system you're operating in, that should be a good starting point. And that will change and evolve over time.
Thanks, Elaine. I was reading your body language. I felt like you had something to add.
But I think,
Thank you.
I think it's, I think I completely 100% agree with what you said. I think what happens as well is as you become more experienced, you start to, you know, you always try to, when you first start in your career, you sort of try to fit in. You don't want to necessarily stand out, and then you work out the culture of the company. And if you take your thing of modelling yourself on people, you go, okay, what attributes do they have, and how do I?
I don't want you to model yourself on people.
But the things that are make you successful at Hearst versus an agency versus a different business, and sometimes you can sort of realise that actually the attributes that that people have or that I need in order to be successful here are not in line with my base values or the things that I agree with. And then at that point, you either go, can I change the business, or can I change the path or the role, or do I change companies, or do I change careers? Like, it's almost a case of constant reevaluation and kind of being, just, again, you are the individual. Because you've got a job somewhere, it doesn't mean that you owe them or that you have to fit into that. You know, I've worked at organisations which are not reflective of who I am. But I understood that before I went there. So it was almost like I'm never going to be on the sort of leadership team there. But I know what I can do. I do that for a bit, and then I'll go somewhere that's more reflective of me. So as you kind of get more experience, and as your experiences in media change, you'll sort of start to work out, well, that, working at that business is really good because they've got this, this, and this. And I've talked to a few people in through MEFA as well about when D&I and diversity inclusion is authentic and when it's almost a tick box. And there's certain, there's big companies who often say, yeah, we do this, we do that. But when you talk to the actual people, they go, this is not what I want. And actually, I still go into the senior team meetings and there's no one who looks like me and there's no route for people like me. And you sort of have to almost assess it where you're at and looking at that. But I completely agree with your point.
It is about assessing it.
Developing a professional persona is not conforming or being compliant. It's being smart, right? And that evolves all the time, right? Hopefully, you wouldn't put the same profile picture on LinkedIn that you would on other social media channels, right? And I was having a conversation with my eldest.
You said, ooh.
Well, you would. I know you would. But I was having a conversation with my oldest son, right? He's got all these people at work following him, and I'm like, you sure about that? Develop your professional persona, right? One of my proudest memories is I worked for the most right-wing, ran a team, made them a lot of money for one of the most right-wing newspapers, Brexit supporting, anti-immigration papers in the country, if not the world. And a Friday afternoon, I was busting budgie banter in the office. That was my professional persona, right? But that took 2 years to get to the stage of evolution where I was happy with my level of success that I was going to play that on a Friday afternoon, right? So it's always evolving, and you've got to check in with, as Elaine said, what's the navigation within the organisation? Are you happy with the persona you've got to develop to be successful within that? And more importantly, as Elaine said, your career's not this moment in time. Your careers, we work until we're 80, right? So unless we're really lucky.
You looked upset.
We're working until we're 80. So we might as well embrace it and realise that persona evolves.
Yeah, and plus we have to remember it's a teachable moment as well. Like, I remember when I first joined media, you remember my old team. I mean, I loved them, 3 middle-aged white guys. But I remember when I was just like, we used to go to like lovely fancy restaurants, but I was like, I like a Nando's, guys. So I don't think I took them to Nando's, and literally they were like, "What we need to bring we need to go up and order. We have to go and collect our own." But it's a teachable. I was like, "This is what I want to do." Like, it's a moment where I was thinking, like, I'm in this space, but at the same time, as much as they're teaching me stuff, I'm teaching them stuff as well. Like, and my director as well, which Neil Ivey loved the guy, so he used to enjoy, and I like the shock element as well. So every Friday he used to play like musical Fridays. He'll play certain songs, and I'll be like, "Yeah, that's Eric Clapton. Yeah. Oh, I know that's Anthony and Johnston's." And he's always be really shocked. Then I'll be like, listen to my music. And at the same time, like at that time, Funky House was big, and I've gone to do Head, Shoulders, Knees and Toes.
Yeah.
Do you know what? It was one of the funniest things I've ever witnessed. I got my friend Michelle, who was on reception at the time, to come up and see him, like proper doing the. But again, it's like.
You took a video.
I mean, that's it's going back a bit. So no, I'm joking.
I just want.
Yeah,
go on. No,
I
finish.
was just going to say, it literally can be a teachable moment as well. Like in terms of someone playing, certain types of music, I think it works both ways, and I think we do have to remember that. as Ryan said, if you're not in the spaces that, you know, you feel you can, even if that's really small. I mean, Nando's and playing certain musics is really small, but that was my entry point of showing part of myself, right? And we've developed and gone further. Like in my current at 7 Stars, Hannah knows, every Black History Month now we do a DJ battle, which I never thought I would ever do in any, like imagine people like shocking out to Afrobeats on the 9th floor, but I never thought I'd be comfortable enough to ever do it at HT. But as Simon said, I've been in industry for 15 years. I've become a bit more unapologetic and bringing more of myself into the office. So it can be really small steps as well. So it doesn't have to like be the big things, but it can be the small things that are teachable for the people that you work with as well.
Thank you. I always tell people, you really don't want my full self, you know? I'm a real South London guy. If you really want this,
would you get fired?
Yeah. But all jokes aside, I think one of the themes that I've seen come out in what you're talking about is tools, right? So the tool is in speaking in a language that people understand, or, you know, using a particular type of language that may not be natural to you, but it's almost like I'm not going to go to a French waiter and try and communicate in English. I'm going to try and use French. And it might not be natural to me, but this is a tool to get me to where I need to go. And once I've used that tool, I can go back to using English again. And, you know, this theme of tools is something that I've seen kind of, you know, throughout, you know, all of the contributions that you've all made. But given that we're talking about tools, this panel is a tool. Did you like that segue? That was nice, right? And I'm always like hyper aware that when we do panels, we are often controlling the narrative, and the person who's asking the questions is often controlling the narrative. But it's really important that you get what you need out of this conversation. So if there's something that you haven't heard, if there's a question I haven't asked, if there is a theme that we haven't explored when it comes to what we're attempting to hit today, now is your opportunity to ask the question. Now, I know you're not scared because you've been laughing along and I've been looking in some of your faces, so I know that you're interacting. Does anyone in the room have a burning question that they'd like to ask? I'm so sure. Yes.
People, yeah.
We'll start at the front and then we'll come to you afterwards.
Oh, Mike. Hi, Fiona from Captify. We are an audience specialist, and quite often we get asked by agencies if we can target by sort of race and gender, and even by, with you being in healthcare now, Si, about, you know, we're talking about prostate cancer, right? So these very specific segments, and we're not allowed to by the GDPR. So how does that kind of influence and frustrate you in Michelle, your media planning and buying, Ryan, in, you know, the sort of multicultural sort of audience that you represent over at Hearst? Because I'm always coming up against this. I specifically work on the data team, bringing search data into the business. And I have to be really careful. Like, I want to strike up a relationship with Brand Advance and the great sort of like sites that they're representing. I want to do more buying across diverse sites. But I always come up against this kind of very nervous feeling inside with generally our head of ops and our internal legal counsel going, just no, we just don't want to go there and you're just going to have to say no. How do you get around that?
It's a great question. Thank you.
Isn't the first point having the inventory in the first place? You touched upon it in terms of having like brand, because I think that's the biggest thing, right? In terms of like, actually what inventory do you have access to? And I think, as you mentioned, Brand Advance, and, you know, I think there's diversity media sales as well that represents, like, you know, minority publishers as well. So I think that's the first step, because then after you wouldn't have to have that explicit conversation, because it won't be breaching any GDPR, because it won't be going that niche, if that makes sense. It just becomes a broader audience. So I think that's normally the first point. So I think the reason why we're coming up against this is because we haven't really looked at it before, right? And actually, unless we go direct to these publishers, and actually, you know, bigger companies like you guys who we naturally buy, you know, agencies have, you know, agreements with, etc. I think it's having that inventory in the first place, then it shouldn't become an issue, if that makes sense. Because if I just come to you and go, actually, I want to target, obviously you might say if you can't go that granular, but like, I want to upweight to this audience. You've got that inventory there. You should be able to do that without breaching any GDPR. But that's the fundamental problem, isn't it? It's having that inventory.
Yeah. So, and as soon
place.
as you start targeting by inventory, then layering on search data audience segmentation, you end up targeting 5 people. That's the problem that we see at Captify.
But to that point, if they've done the investment, the business investment, to be authentic in their messaging, right, and their briefing, then context is super powerful. and you won't be targeting those 5 people because your context will be laser focused, right? And you'll embrace the diversity within whatever group you're trying to target, right? Because, you know, irrespective of what group you're in, whether you determine yourself to be marginalized or not, you are not all the same person, right? And again, if they've done the investment, the client that is, or indeed the agency, I admit, have done the investment to be authentic, that briefing process is smoother. So you won't be targeting 5 people because the context is all powerful, right? And in these days of, I don't know, like call it post-data days, right? What people read and engage with is even, I mean, we're in a building which facilitates it, right? So I think that won't be the case. I think it goes further up the food chain. And have they done a business investment to enable you to do your job, which is to filter that context to its most powerful effect?
I think that's one of the things, you know, we're doing. We're working on how do we do that, and we look at it, you know, how do you group certain types of content together? How do we build profiles on publications so we know that X% of our audience are from that group? We don't necessarily say you can buy against it, and it kind of leads into a thought that I've had on this is that we often talk about diversity, but diversity isn't this little group that sits on the side. It's you know, we talk about diversity and inclusivity, yet we put it in a little bucket and go, I want to target these people in this thing. It's actually making sure that these people in this thing are, you know, reflective of everything. So you can be finding ways to do it, but you're right, there is a challenge on that. I think it's using multiple tools, and it's not having an obsession with reach, because, you know, like I was thinking about this earlier when you were talking about, you know, there are very wealthy Asian black people. So if you go into TGI and you type in AB1 adults 35 plus, Mail Online is going to be top. Like, and then you can make your own judgment on context and that audience, right? But essentially, if you run it on reach, you'll always end up with the same stuff. So you almost have to layer different things on top of it. And it is hard because a client will just often look at numbers. And so as long as you've got some science behind it, it is a difficult thing to do from a publisher point of view, but we are trying to find ways of grouping content together. And the idea is that if you're talking about a certain thing or you're talking about a certain area, you can almost identify it without identifying the individual.
We've only got a few minutes left. There's another question. Do you want to add? And then I'm just aware of time. But
yes, I was just going to quickly add on that. That's a really good point in terms of like the community is in other platforms. So like we focus on like certain publications, but you know, for myself, I'm massively into sport. So actually I will watch BT Sport, I will watch Sky, and actually a whole load of my community are doing that as well. It comes down to a bit what someone was talking about in terms of the content and the tonality. That's where you pique certain people's interest in terms of like the talent that you're using. And actually, as Elaine talks about in terms of that Disney advert, in terms of like actually having a Filipino family, and actually then one step further, actually they had, you know, the soundtrack was done by Griff, who was like she's mixed actually, she's half black and half Chinese, but it was authentic all the way through, and that's how you get that audience as well. So like it's not always just concentrating on that, you know, small niche title that 5 people read, but we are everywhere basically.
Be expansive.
Exactly.
Love
There
it.
you go.
Question just here.
Sorry.
Thanks. Hi, Azad here, currently in between jobs. Firstly, thank you very much for all the expertise that you've shared. It's been really, really useful and resonates a lot. My question is in relation to pushing the dial. So you touched a little bit on trying to encourage clients. Sometimes our detractors can come within our own organization as well, and not necessarily consciously. Working as someone that D&I isn't the main job, but is part of what you do, how do you recognize when pushing the dial needs to be toned back for your own mental well-being, as opposed to when you just need to, you know, have a different approach to trying to get the story across?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Thank you for asking that question, because I always rate the people who are doing that work internally, often on the side of their day job. And often they are from marginalised groups themselves, repping hard. And to talk about your identity and the work that needs to get done for people like you is tiring. So the first and foremost thing is to centre you and you first, because you are not here to serve your organisation first and foremost. For me, the answer... Thank you. I was like, shit, have I run out of time? So for me, the question is for the ally, anyone who calls themselves an ally, right? And we can all be allies for different people, for different communities. if you're in this room and you're stepping through this little gate here and you are wanting to promote DEI, then you are pushing and promoting change. So if you're an ally, you should be looking out for who else is pushing change, particularly those from underrepresented groups, and what do they need. So sorry, I didn't hear your name. Right, so what do you need? How can I help you? How can I support you? How can I add structure, budget, rigor to what you're doing to make it easier for you to have a voice? So if you are an ally in this room or you call yourselves, it's a verb. DEI is a verb. So for me, it is about stepping up and understanding that there are some people in this room who are saying, how do I make sure I'm looking after my mental health? That's a big fucking question. So if you care, then you need to kind of go, okay, well, I can support this person because it can be heavy. So for me, that's one side of it. So I'm kind of lecturing there, I understand. But that is the route. You are the majority usually if you're not the underrepresented person. Secondly, just back to you, I think, find your people in your community. So if there are employee resource groups or there's pockets in an employee resource group that speak to you, and ask the right questions of your manager or the people around you. What support are you offering for me? What equitable learning or development are you offering for me? Can I access certain opportunities? And who is really advocating for you? Kind of look for that. And arguably, to be honest, I'm kind of the advocate that if you're not getting enough, then talent walks, really. And that's what the employers should know. Thank you. But that's not so easy. That's a very privileged position because I've got bills to pay. So I implore you to kind of put the work down if it's too much, actually, because there'll be someone else after you and what you've done will make a difference for the next person who's stepping into it.
I think that's a great question to end on, and thank you so much for bringing the human in, because often we can talk about ourselves as employees and forget that we're actually feeling human beings. Just wanted to thank you so much for coming here today and being involved in the panel. It felt very, not as interactive as it could have been maybe because of time, but it felt like you were with us the whole journey. And that's really important when we're having these really difficult conversations. You do have an opportunity though to ask the panelists questions because there will be some mixing and mingling. There are also magazines at the back. Did I miss anything? There's drinks, food, pizza. Some of the drinks are alcoholic. If you're not on that, there's some non-alcoholic drinks there as well. But thank you all so much for spending time with us today. I think it was a really important conversation.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you very much for hosting.
Thank you.